America has some really spectacular architecture. It also has some architectural gems that unfortunately have been demolished over the years. This list looks at 10 of the most incredible American buildings that are no longer standing. First up at number 10, we're headed to downtown Detroit for the old Detroit City Hall building. Construction began on the James Anderson designed building in 1867 and was completed in 1871. The total bill for the project was just over $600,000. City Hall featured a number of architectural accents, but the focal point was the spectacular 180-foot clock tower. Despite its beauty, efforts to demolish and replace the building began just over 20 years after it was built. These discussions ebbed and flowed over the next 6 decades until it was finally demolished in 1961. This took place due to a city council vote of 5-4. When Detroit's citizens were polled, nearly 60% favored preservation of the building. Next up, we're headed across the Great Lakes region to Chicago for the Old Chicago Federal Building. This 300-foot tall behemoth of a building was completed in 1905 and took up an entire city block. The total cost was around $4 million, with another $2 million set aside for interior design work. There were a lot of impressive elements to the building, but none were more impressive than the large dome, inspired by the dome at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Despite its grandeur, the federal building faced challenges from the start. Its inefficient layout and outdated facilities led to its obsolescence by the 1950s. In 1965, the building was demolished to make way for a new federal complex. This demolition sparked a preservation movement in Chicago as citizens tried to protect the city's architectural heritage. The replacement buildings were much taller and provided far more usable space than the previous building, but they also lacked the style and architectural flair of the original federal building. At number 8, we have the Maryland Casualty Company Tower in Baltimore, Maryland. For much of the 20th century, it was one of the most unique buildings in the Baltimore skyline. Originally completed in 1912, the steel-framed building rose 330 feet in the air. During the 1960s, the Maryland Casualty Company had grown enough that the building was no longer large enough for their needs. Around this time, demolition was kicked around, but didn't actually happen. A Baltimore developer was able to lead a major adaptive reuse construction project to convert the old office building into a mixed-use property that included a shopping mall. Unfortunately, the revival was somewhat short-lived. By the 1980s, engineering analysis revealed major structural problems with the building, so much so that the building was deemed to be unsafe. City officials decided the building was beyond repair, and in 1986, despite the building's historical and architectural significance, it was torn down. I know I'm going to catch some flack for putting this one on the list, but at number 7, we have the Prentice Women's Hospital in Chicago. It first opened less than 50 years ago, in 1975, in Chicago's Streeterville neighborhood. The one-of-a-kind design featured 4 concrete cylinders cantilevered over a 5-story podium. The building was one of the first to utilize computer-aided design, making it a historic building in the world of construction and engineering. By 2007, only about 30 years after it opened, the hospital relocated to a larger, more efficiently laid-out building. And by 2011, the building was fully vacant. A fierce debate raged between Northwestern University, who favored demolition, and preservationists who supported various adaptive reuse projects. Despite the opposition, the university moved forward with demolition, which was completed in 2014. While the brutalist style of architecture may not be particularly popular today, it does represent a fascinating time in history and, in my opinion, is worth preserving. For number 6, we have the Erie County Savings Bank building in Buffalo, New York. First opening in 1893, it was one of the most spectacular buildings in downtown Buffalo. The Romanesque Revival-style architecture featured a somewhat castle-like appearance with ornate turrets, arched windows, and granite walls. Like many of the entries on this list, the late 1960s weren't kind to this building. Mounting issues with outdated plumbing and electrical systems led to a push for demolition during the 60s. Interestingly, Thomas Edison was one of the chief electrical engineers involved in the original construction project. In 1968, the building was taken down and replaced with a much more modern and much more boring tower. Coming in at number 5, we have the Wabash Terminal in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a time around the turn of the 20th century when Pittsburgh was not only one of the wealthiest places in America, but also one of the wealthiest places in the world. Its spectacular architecture from this time period reflects these vast riches. Wabash Terminal was located near the confluence of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers. It was a grand railroad station constructed between 1901 and 1904 as part of George Gould's ambitious plan to create a transcontinental railroad system. The ornate 9-story terminal building opened 4th of July 1904. The project also included the construction of the Wabash Bridge, which was completed earlier in 1904, and was briefly the longest railroad bridge in the country. Despite the high hopes, the Wabash-Pittsburgh Terminal Railway faced numerous challenges and went bankrupt just 4 years after opening. Passenger traffic ceased in 1931, rendering the terminal building obsolete. Then, in 1946, a fire destroyed the structure, leading to the demolition of the remainder of the building. The demolition of the Wabash Terminal coincided with Pittsburgh's Renaissance 1 urban renewal project. Back to the Great Lakes region for number 4, we have the old Milwaukee train station. The Everett Street Depot was constructed in 1886. Located in downtown Milwaukee, the depot quickly became a bustling hub in the heart of the city. The station's most striking feature was its impressive 140-foot tall clock tower, which dominated the skyline until the 1950s when it was lowered, with the clock repositioned just above the roofline. The depot was equipped with 4 tracks beneath a long train shed and additional staging tracks on either side. At its peak, the Everett Street Depot served approximately 2,500 passengers daily, managing around 50 trains. It was particularly famous for hosting the renowned Hiawatha service, named after Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's epic poem to symbolize comfort, speed, and efficiency. The station's 79-year tenure came to an end August 1, 1965, due to changing transportation preferences and economic factors. It was demolished a year later and replaced with a hideous train station that quickly became hated due to its awful design. At number 3, we have a 2-for-1 deal where both the Singer Tower and the City Investing Building were demolished to make way for an unattractive rectangular black skyscraper in, you guessed it, the late 1960s. Both of the original buildings were spectacular in their own right, but the Singer Tower was truly one of a kind. Construction started in 1897, and only a year later, the first phase of the building was open for business. It would be another decade before the full tower would be complete, and for a short period of time, the tower was the tallest in the world. The 41-story building stood over 600 feet tall and had 16 elevators and nearly 500,000 square feet of office space. The City Investing Building was also pretty spectacular. It was completed in 1908 and stood almost 500 feet tall. It too had around 500,000 square feet of office space. Interestingly, with this building, despite its massive size, the building's foundations were less than 20 feet deep. Unfortunately, both these buildings were demolished between 1966 and 1968 to make way for One Liberty Plaza, which at the time was seen as a modern upgrade for the site. At the time of the demolition, the Singer Tower was the tallest building voluntarily demolished by its owners in history. At number 2, we have Pittsburgh's old 4th Avenue Post Office. Remember not too long ago when I said Pittsburgh was kind of wealthy back in the beginning of the 20th century? Well, this post office is another example of that. Work started on this building in 1881, but wouldn't be finished for more than a decade. The foundation work alone took 3 years. Marble and granite were shipped from all over America, and mahogany was imported from Africa for the build. When it opened in 1892, it served as Pittsburgh's primary post office for half a century. Once again, the insanity that was 1960s urban planning would turn out to be the final nail in the coffin for this building. It was demolished in 1966, but at least this time it was replaced with something far more architecturally, aesthetically, historically, and culturally significant: a parking lot. For number 2, Part B, we're headed to another pretty spectacular post office, the New York City Hall Post Office. The City Hall Post Office was constructed between 1869 and 1880. Interestingly, despite its grand design, the building was not well received at all and earned the nickname Mullet's Monstrosity after the architect who designed it, Alfred Mullet. Critics deemed it an architectural eyesore and complained that not only was it ugly, but it lacked the functionality of other buildings. By 1912, there was already calls for its demolition, with the New York Times describing it as unsatisfactory to the post office and the federal courts that used it. The building's fate was sealed in the late 1930s as New York City was preparing for the 1939 World's Fair. In 1938, the elaborate granite structure was demolished to make way for an extension of City Hall Park. The demolition was part of a broader initiative to allegedly beautify the city and provide employment during the Great Depression. Ironically, with the passage of time and changing of architectural tastes, The City Hall Post Office is now regarded as one of Mullet's best works. And finally, at number 1, we have one of the most spectacular buildings in American history, the Old Pennsylvania Station in New York City. It was completed in 1910 and was a masterpiece of the Beaux Arts style of architecture. Covering 8 acres, it stretched 788 feet along side streets and 432 feet along the main avenues. The station's construction required excavation of over 3 million cubic yards of dirt and used 490,000 cubic feet of pink granite, 60,000 cubic feet of interior stone, and 27,000 tons of steel. There's too many architectural highlights to list them all, but just a few of them included 84 columns that look straight out of ancient Rome, a 150-foot tall waiting room, and a concourse doused in natural light streaming through the steel and glass roof. At its peak in 1945, the station served around 100 million passengers annually. However, the rise of automobile and air traffic led to declining rail usage. In 1962, plans were announced to demolish the station, and only a year later, demolition actually started. The station's destruction sparked the creation of the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965. The current Penn Station, an underground complex, was built beneath Madison Square Garden and Pennsylvania Plaza. While functional, it lacks the architectural splendor of its predecessor. Thanks for watching. If you want to support the channel, please subscribe and share the video and like it and comment and all that stuff. New videos out every Friday.